This is part 4, the Buddhist, our section on Buddhism. Today we're going to take a look at 4 major sects of Buddhism, all of which fall under the category of Mahayana, which we talked about in our last lesson. Except for Tibetan Buddhism, which is kind of in a category of its own, though it is very much related to Mahayana. It kind of depends upon what scholar you're talking to. Some people think Tibetan Buddhism is part of Mahayana. Other people call it Vajrayana. The diamond vehicle is something separate from either Theravada or Mahayana. We're also going to talk about Zen Buddhism, which is also known as Chan Buddhism. We're going to talk about Pure Land Buddhism and Nichiren Buddhism. Okay. So, we're kind of up to the Middle Ages now in terms of history. Buddhism entered Japan in about 500 CE, and it kind of entered Japan through Zen Buddhism, which really took hold there. Though Zen Buddhism actually had its start in China, which we'll talk about. In the following century, Buddhism took hold in Tibet, and around the 13th century, it was the life of Nichiren, who we're going to talk about today, who founded a very important and widespread sect of Buddhism. So this is the symbol of Zen Buddhism. It's a fascinating symbol because we talked about this in the beginning of the class, that symbols have power, that they can communicate very complex, abstract meanings, and this is perhaps the most abstract of all symbols. It's just an open circle. And it is a symbol of oneness, it is a symbol of a cycle, it is a symbol of emptiness. You will recall that in Mahayana there's a philosophical precept of sunyata, that the universe is essentially empty, right? Everything is just empty. And Zen, Chan Buddhism, really takes on that concept of emptiness and makes it a cornerstone of their tradition. Zen Buddhism was started by a monk named Bodhidharma, who was an Indian monk around the 5th century CE. He, according to legend, he sat and meditated for 9 years in a cave, and he came up with this tradition of Buddhism, the sect, right? Chan, the original name was Chan, which is a Chinese word, which is a transliteration of a Sanskrit word, dhyana, which means meditation. So it is the meditation, or the sitting meditation tradition of Buddhism. In Japan, it took the name Zen from zazen, which means sitting, as I mentioned. The goal of Zen Buddhism is to see one's own nature through meditation and through various forms of training one's mind. One gains clarity and can see one's own nature very clearly, and of course that nature is the Buddha nature, which each person has in them. And it puts a great deal of emphasis, as I've said, on sitting meditation. And through sitting meditation, through clearing the mind, the practitioner, the Zen Buddhist, is trying to see their own nature, but also to regain the original purity of their mind. In Zen Buddhism, there's this idea that everyone's mind had an original state. Your soul or your mind had this original pure state, which has since got kind of gunked up with things of the world. You have to clear that all away. And by doing so, Zen Buddhists believe that they can have a direct experience with the Dharma. You remember, in Buddhism, the Dharma is Buddha's teachings. So for Zen Buddhists, by meditating, by clearing the mind and purifying the self, and seeing one's own true nature, you're getting right to the Buddhist teachings. That's the heart of the Buddhist teachings. And so, interestingly, in Zen Buddhism, there's a slight de-emphasizing of studying the 4 Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, which are, of course, very important. They're the cornerstone of Buddhism. But for Zen Buddhists, they feel like instead of just studying books and studying the teachings of the Buddha, they should try to experience these teachings themselves, to find it themselves through meditation and through finding it themselves. That anyone who follows Zen Buddhism can find these things out for themselves, if that makes sense. In a sense, it's like instead of studying a book on, for example, instead of studying a book on the science of plants, instead of studying a book on botany, right, instead of going through the book and taking a class on it, instead of going out into the wilderness and actually looking for the plants yourself and learning yourself about them. That's what Zen Buddhism is trying to get at with all this sitting meditation. Some of the methods of meditation they use when they're sitting include counting breaths. So you count your breath one at a time, 1, 2, 3, 4. You try to get to 10. You try to get to 10 without letting your mind wander. And if your mind wanders, even for a moment, then you start over again. And I said that it takes many months of practice to be able to do this. Another common method of meditation they use are the koan, which are these little riddles. These little riddles that are meant to like kind of surprise you and thus clear your mind. So if you ever heard of these old riddles like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? What is the sound of one hand clapping? If a tree falls in the woods and no one's there to hear it, does it make a sound? These are all koan. They come from Zen Buddhism. They're these little riddles that have no answer. They purposefully are paradoxical and they have no answer. And it's meant to kind of clear the mind. And also mindful living, just practicing things on a day-to-day basis in a mindful way, even if it's just brushing your teeth. There's a wonderful article in your book, in the chapter on Buddhism, about Zen Buddhism and about life in a Zen monastery. And one thing the abbot talks about is that, it doesn't matter what you're doing. If you're cleaning or brushing your teeth or dressing, you do it in a mindful manner, right? You don't let your mind wander. So, as I mentioned, the goal is to find your Buddha nature and the mind's original purity, which in Japanese is called kensho, and gain understanding of the Dharma through direct experience and intuitive awareness. And an important thing to remember about Zen Buddhism is that in many ways the goal is in the process itself. So the goal of Zen Buddhism is very much wrapped up in the things that you do to find that goal, right? It's being able to do the process correctly. And by doing the process correctly, that's the goal in and of itself. Which is a very kind of cyclical idea, right? So Chan Buddhism began in China, but it really took hold in Japan, where it is still very much a part of Japanese culture. The book does a good job of explaining this. It says 3 of the main values or characteristics of Zen Buddhism are direct awareness, simplicity, and self-restraint. And these are very, very much already Japanese values when Buddhism enters Japan. This is already a very Japanese idea, direct awareness, simplicity, and self-restraint. So it's really only natural that Zen Buddhism took hold in Japan, and the Japanese people took it and they made it very, very Japanese. So today in Japan there are all of these fascinating artistic practices that are meant to help the Zen practitioner, right? For example, here's a Zen Buddhist nun practicing bonsai. She's raising a bonsai tree and she's pruning it, which is a very difficult thing to learn, and is very painstaking, to make the tree grow well and to shape it correctly. Also, there's the tea ceremony, which was already a part of Japanese society. So you have these fascinating tea ceremonies. There are many different tea ceremonies, I should say that. There are different tea ceremonies in Japan, but there are certain ones that are meant to develop a sense of Zen and awareness in oneself. Here you can see a traditional watercolor painting of a Buddhist monk performing the tea ceremony for just a traveler, right? Just very simply, very humble, just outside. And here's a woman practicing it as well. If you've never seen it, you should look it up on YouTube. It is a fascinating ceremony where each and every movement, every hand movement, every gesture of the ceremony is practiced. Nothing is random. It's all pre-designed, right? And it's meant to create a sense of being present in the moment. Very much like when we studied Hinduism, we talked about yoga, about doing, the physical yoga, doing the yoga classes that we take in America. It's a form. Traditionally, that was a form of meditation in India. It forced you to be present in your body, and to think about your breath, and to think about yourself, and to clear your mind. In Zen Buddhism, these practices are meant to do the same thing. And the rock gardens, which is a Japanese art form, right? You've never seen these before. They're fascinating. They're meant to be these abstract pieces of art that represent an oceans and islands and mountains. They represent space and stars. They're meant to be pieces of art that you can meditate on. You can sit, and by looking at them, it calms the mind and it clears the mind. And by setting up the rock garden as well, as this man is doing, it clears the mind. It becomes a Zen act. So that is Zen Buddhism. It also puts a great emphasis on the oneness of everything, right? Part of enlightenment, right, is realizing the oneness of everything, and that's an important part of Zen Buddhist teachings. It also has a very strong Sangha component. Becoming a monk or a nun is an important part of Zen Buddhism. Many practitioners do become monks or nuns, become members of the Sangha for a while. We're going to see there are a couple other sects where, the Sangha it doesn't hold the same importance, or isn't as common for practitioners. One of which is Pure Land. Now, I'm not saying that the Sangha is not an important part of Pure Land. Don't get me wrong, it is. But the interesting thing about Pure Land, it is very much more of a devotional. It's more of a devotional tradition. By devotional, I mean it's more about showing devotion to the Buddha, right? Not just practicing as maybe in Zen Buddhism. Pure Land puts more emphasis on devoting oneself to the Buddha and the Bodhisattvas. Pure Land developed around the 13th century. It was developed by the Amitabha Buddha. Okay, so this is another Buddha. The one we talked about last week was the Shakyamuni Buddha, who came out of India and whatnot. But this is another prince who became a Buddha. In Japan, he's called Amida, the Amida Buddha. This was a time in Japan when there was a good deal of corruption and warring and political upheaval, and there was a great deal of cynicism and amongst the people, and there was this idea that nobody was going to be able to, nobody could reach enlightenment in that sort of environment. So then came the Amitabha Buddha, Amida Buddha, who supposedly, when he found enlightenment and became a Buddha, created a place that you could go to when you died, where it would be a pure land, it would be a perfect pure land, free of any sort of distractions, where you could meditate and find enlightenment even faster, because there wouldn't be so many distractions as there are in the world, right? It would be a perfect place of meditation and finding enlightenment. This idea of the Pure Land is not an original idea. It was an Indian Buddhist idea before it was a Japanese idea. But in the Indian Buddhist tradition, it was very abstract. It wasn't people, great Buddha masters or teachers might know of the Pure Land, but the details of the Pure Land weren't really fleshed out. They couldn't really tell you exactly where it was or exactly what it was, but there was this idea that there was a Pure Land somewhere out there in some realm that would help you find enlightenment. Japanese took that and they really filled out all the details of it. And it was easy because traditional Japanese religion, which is Shinto, had a long practice of worshiping mountains. And there's also an idea in East Asian religion that the immortals, that the gods, lived in the west, somewhere west of where they were. And the Pure Land in Indian Buddhist tradition was said to be in the west. So the Japanese kind of took this and they came up with this idea or they didn't come up with this idea, they developed this tradition wherein the Amida Buddha was in the Pure Land, and which was beyond the mountains. Now there's another kind of Pure Land Buddhism, and that's Jodo Shinshu, true Pure Land Buddhism, which is even more devotional, and really didn't mix with Shinto very well, but it took the devotional aspect, this idea that the Amida Buddha had set up this Pure Land for people to go to when they died, and they kind of took it a step further and said that if you were extremely devotional to the Amida Buddha, then he would take you up. So much so that, around the feudal ages, there was a practice in Japan where rich people would have these huge paintings of the Pure Land, right? And in the middle of the painting of the Pure Land would be a picture of the Amida Buddha, and he would have a red string, an actual red string coming out of the painting, made to look like the Amida Buddha was holding it. And in rich families, when you were on your deathbed, they would bring out this picture, and they would give the person on their deathbed one end of the red string to give them something to meditate on. And the idea was that if at the moment of their death that they were completely focused on the Amida Buddha and they were repeating the mantra, the Amida Buddha, right? Because mantras and chanting are very important in Buddhism. We're going to talk about that in the next lesson more. But if you chanted the specific mantra of the Amida Buddha and held this red string and focused on this image, you would for certain go to the Pure Land, and you wouldn't be reincarnated back into the world. You would stay in the Pure Land until you found enlightenment. Now, I have spoken to one or two of the Buddhists who really find the idea of the Pure Land to be kind of not fitting with the spirit of Buddhism, right? I've heard people take issue with this idea that you can just skip reincarnating. You can just skip that whole cycle of reincarnation, just go straight to some place where, you can just be on the fast track to enlightenment. I've heard Buddhists say that that's not the spirit of Buddhism. In Buddhism, it's about effort, it's about it's about dealing with your suffering and facing it, and that facing your suffering and learning to be detached from it helps you, reach enlightenment. That in a Pure Land, that it's kind of cheating in a sense. And yet, Pure Land Buddhism is extremely popular in Asia. I would argue that would be in part because of its devotional quality. A lot of people look for a religion that is devotional in character. They want a leader to look to, so to speak. They want a divine intercessor, who will be there for them when they have troubles in their lives. People often, turn to religion because they're looking for a higher power to point them in the right direction or help them or be an inspiration to them. And Pure Land Buddhism very much provides that. Now, Pure Land Buddhism, not true Pure Land, but Pure Land, puts more emphasis on the meditation side of things, I would say. But it's a very unique tradition. It's very unique amongst the other sects of Buddhism. Now here's some Japanese art, Pure Land art. You can see here. This is the Amida Buddha. His vision is directly on this. There's a humble little follower right here who's kneeling before him, and these lines indicate to the viewer that the Amida Buddha sees him, right? He sees the smallest person, and these are the Amida Buddha's attendants. They're essentially like angels, and they're coming down on a cloud, right? In Asian art, they have these beautiful stylistic clouds, and these are mountains. So these coming down out of the mountains, right? Here, in this picture, he's actually walking down the mountain. And again, he's surrounded by attendants. This is a picture of the Pure Land. You can see all the beautiful architecture. This is, I want to say that this is Chinese, from the style of architecture and from the coloring. It could be Japanese, though. You can see these beautiful, again, these stylistic clouds. Right, and there are these little streaks behind them. There's this, because the artist is trying to show movement, that these divine, angel-like attendants are flying down on these clouds. And there are all the people here, right, and other. These could be bodhisattvas. They could be Buddhas as well. I'm not positive, but in the middle here is Amida Buddha. So that is Pure Land Buddhism. Now, we're going to look at another form of Japanese Buddhism, Nichiren, based upon Nichiren, a man who lived in the 13th century, and he believed that salvation or enlightenment could be found through the Lotus Sutra. Sutra is a Sanskrit word that means like teachings or writings. There are a lot of sutras, right? In Hinduism, in Buddhism, both, there are a lot of different sutras. The Lotus Sutra is a compilation of stories and chants and lessons of people who followed the Dharma, and because they followed the Dharma, they found enlightenment. So the Lotus Sutra is a compilation of good examples for people to follow. Like, this is how, if you want to follow the Dharma, if you want to follow Buddha's Dharma, his teachings, this is how you do it. This is how people follow it. And it's a very popular text in Buddhism, and Nichiren believed that, it was the most important of the texts. In particular, there were two bodhisattvas. There are many bodhisattvas in the Lotus Sutra, but there are two in particular that he believed were great examples to people. One was the bodhisattva of superb action, who spreads the perfect truth throughout the universe, and then there's the bodhisattva ever abused, who's a bodhisattva who everywhere he goes is persecuted for teaching the lessons of the Buddha. And yet he continues to teach the lessons of the Buddha. And specifically, he is persecuted for suggesting that every person has a Buddha nature. The chant that Nichiren Buddhists use a lot or recite often is Namu Myoho Rengi Kyo, which is to honor the Lotus Sutra. I didn't mention, but Pure Land Buddhists have their own mantra or their own chant, and that is Namu Amida Butsu. Amida Butsu. Amida is the Amida Buddha, and Butsu, which is the Japanese word for Buddha. So praise the Amida Buddha is what it is. Namu Amida Butsu. And for Nichiren, it's Namu Myoho Rengi Kyo, which is to honor or to praise the Lotus Sutra. It is still a very popular popular sect in East Asia, not just in Japan. It's very well known for its peace walks and its social activism. Nichiren Buddhism puts a great deal of emphasis upon acting in wider society, right? The Shakyamuni Buddha did not teach that people should separate themselves from society, rather that they should try not to become attached to society, but still try and live with it and try to show compassion and help purify it. So Nichiren Buddhists are involved in environmental movements, justice movements, movements for for poverty, for diseases, for all sorts of things. They're also known because they have this very unique rosary. Buddhists often use rosaries, similar to Catholic rosaries. There are all these little beads, and Buddhists will use those. They'll say their chant, Namu Myoho Renge Kyo, or whatever chant that they prefer, and they'll say it a set number of times, and the beads help them keep count. So for each time they say it, they touch a bead. They move along the string, and that helps them keep count. But this also has these five tassels, which have various symbolic meanings having to do with the life of Nichiren and the practices of a good Buddhist. Compared with Pure Land and Zen Buddhism, Nichiren tends to focus a lot upon, using Buddhist ideals and values to improve society. And Zen is very focused on inner transformation and outer transformation as well, transforming the world around you. But in Zen Buddhism, it's very much focused on first finding enlightenment and finding Kensho before you can, before going on to the world. And Pure Land Buddhism is more devotional. And then there's Tibetan Buddhism. It is a very elaborate branch, a very rich tradition that is based both in Indian Buddhism, right? A lot of Tibetan Buddhism was influenced by Chinese Buddhism to some extent. Chinese Buddhism being Chan Buddhism, or Zen Buddhism, as we talked about before, but more so on Indian Buddhism, but also on Bon, which is traditional Tibetan religion, right? A polytheistic tradition that goes back, many centuries. And on the one hand, it's very interesting. Today there's a great emphasis in Tibetan Buddhism upon studying and teaching Indian Buddhism in its purest original form, and also incorporating Tibetan practices. So it's a really interesting tradition. Some of the Bon components include prayer flags. We'll look at some pictures later, but you may have seen them before. These great strings with these colorful little pieces of fabric that hang from them that have prayers on them, and hanging those on trees, hanging them in temples, hanging them in different places. Specific rituals for the dying. There are a good number of rituals for the dying in Tibetan Buddhism that are likely have their roots in Bon. Also prayer wheels, which we'll look at. So a lot of traditional Bon practices and Indian Buddhist teachings. It's often called the Diamond Vehicle, Vajrayana. It is also the source. Tibetan Buddhism is a source of Tantra, which you may have heard of before. What Tantra means, people have interpreted in a lot of weird kind of ways. But really what Tantra is, it's these ancient esoteric teachings. The word esoteric means hidden or secret. Esoteric teachings are teachings that are not taught to everyone. They're taught to only a few. Like in Hinduism, certain Vedic teachings, like the Upanishads, were not taught to the public but for many centuries were only taught to the Brahmin caste, the caste of priests who were considered to be spiritually and mentally superior and able to understand the teachings, right? So all these esoteric teachings in Tantra as well, which involve visualization rituals, visualization meditation rituals, mantras, which are these chants, mudras, which are hand symbols, mandalas, which are these gorgeous sand paintings, as well as invoking bodhisattvas and Buddhas for help, reaching enlightenment, and a good deal of other practices as well. And there are a good number of tantric practices and teachings in Buddhism, and you can't just find them anywhere. You have to go to a lama, who is a great master in Tibetan Buddhism, who will judge you to be worthy or not worthy of learning different esoteric teachings. Deity yoga is a big part of Tibetan Buddhism, where you meditate on images of deities. One part of Bon that remains in Tibetan Buddhism is all these different deities who are treated as, sometimes some of these deities are treated as kind of like bodhisattvas. Some of them are treated as like protectors of the Buddha, or as spirits, or as members of a different realm. In Tibetan Buddhism, there's this idea that there are different realms. There's a human realm, and there's kind of a heavenly realm, and there's a hellish realm, and that you can be reincarnated into any of them. But specifically, the deities, the gods that are kind of treated as bodhisattvas and Buddhas themselves, as higher beings themselves, are meditated on. And sometimes there are certain esoteric teachings, certain esoteric practices where one imagines oneself to be one of those deities in order to incorporate their spiritual characteristics into themselves, in order to kind of become one with that deity and purify oneself and develop those characteristics in oneself. There are a lot of stories in Tibetan Buddhism of great Tibetan masters having special powers. You find that you do find that in other sects of Buddhism as well, but especially in Tibetan Buddhism. Things for everything from controlling your body temperature, controlling your heart rate, to even hovering off the ground, or all sorts of different things, healing people, all sorts of different sort of miraculous powers that the great teachers of Tibetan Buddhism are said to sometimes develop. So, I showed you this last week. This is the Tibetan Tanka. This is the Wheel of Life. It's very much based on the Dharma wheel, and yet it also incorporates the 6 states, 6 different states that people can be reincarnated as. The Deva realm, where the gods live. The Ashura realm, not so sure about the Ashura realm. The human realm, we know. The animal realm. The hungry ghost realm. It's very much a Chinese idea. The hungry ghost realm is a horrible place to be reincarnated as. Hungry ghosts are people who are suffering for their sins in their lives by having these huge bloated bellies and these tiny, tiny necks, so that no matter how long they live, no matter how much they eat, they're never full, because they can only eat a little bit at a time. And people who are said to have developed a good deal of horrible karma and sinned a great deal in life will be reincarnated as a hungry ghost. If I'm not mistaken, I'm pretty sure that's originally a Chinese idea, the hungry ghost. And it looks like it got incorporated into Tibetan traditions as well. And then finally, there's hell itself. So these different realms that you can be reincarnated as. And then they have these ideas of the 12 links of dependent origination. There's Yama, right, the Lord of Death. Again, this is a Bon god. This is a traditional Tibetan god who, gets kind of reinterpreted into Buddhist tradition, where he's turning the wheel of life. And then the three delusions, greed, hatred, and lust, represented by a pig, a snake, and a rooster, or a cock. And these are the delusions that keep us attached to the world, right? They're the center of the wheel because they keep, everything spinning. You have to let go of these delusions. You have to recognize them in order to get out of the wheel. And here's the Buddha up here, and he points to the moon, which symbolizes liberation. There's a rabbit on the moon because in Asia, this is an interesting little cultural tidbit that's not Buddhist, but just in Asia in general, people say that if you look at the moon, you can see an outline of a rabbit. Have you ever heard anyone, talk about the man in the moon? Like you can see a face of a man in the moon. In Asia, it's not a man; it's a rabbit. There's a rabbit in the moon. So that's kind of folklore. That's not religious, but here we see it. Folklore, is very much part of religious imagination, though, isn't it? And there's an interesting figure of speech that Buddhists use about the finger and the moon, and that is that Buddha points to the moon, which is to say, he points the way to liberation. You have to be careful because some people who aren't too smart, if you said to them, if they said to you, "Where's the moon?" and you pointed, you said, "There's the moon," they might think your finger is the moon. They might not realize where you're pointing to. So in Buddhism, there's this idea that, the teachings and the rituals, the offerings, all the things that Buddhists do are pointing. They point to the moon. What I mean is that if you go into a Buddhist temple and you see a statue of the Buddha and you see people, bowing to the Buddha, what they're supposed to be doing is bowing to their own Buddha nature, right? That's what that symbol, the statue of the Buddha is pointing, is reminding you, teaching you that you have a Buddha nature, and that's what you're supposed to be bowing to. If you're bowing to the statue itself, that's like bowing to the finger that's pointing at the moon. You're mistaking it. It's not to be taken literally. Statues, the incense offerings you see in temples, the temples themselves. We're going to look at next time. They give offerings of flowers and water and fruit to the images of the Buddha. You can't take it literally. It's figurative. These are figurative offers that point towards liberation. And that is why there is a Buddha there pointing at the moon. That's what that means. Reminds people. Here are some other images from Tibetan Buddhism. This is Tara. These are both Tara, actually. Talk about Tara in your book. She is a Tibetan goddess. She is the goddess of the earth. She has several forms. She has the green Tara form. There's a white Tara form. Or is that? That might not be Tara. That might be Avalokiteshvara. I'm sorry. I put these PowerPoints together last semester, and I can't even remember which pictures I put in here now. I know that's green Tara, though. So that's a goddess. And again, look at her. She's portrayed like a bodhisattva. And so she is a bodhisattva, right? And then there is, I think that's Avalokiteshvara. It might be white Tara. I'm not positive. And here is Yama, the god of death, the lord of death, who crushes ignorance and also protects the Buddha realm. He's a protector of all things pure and good. And you see a lot of Buddhist temples have these horrible, scary figures, and they're there to frighten away ignorance and delusion and things like that. They're not there to frighten away people. Down here, this is Tibetan Buddhist practice of mandalas. Take a look at this. This is a really unique practice. It is a meditative practice in and of itself. They're making images that have symbolic value, and there are many, many different mandala designs. But they have monks do this. They have all this colored sand, and then they have these narrow tubes. And what they do is they put a little bit of sand in this tube, and then they rub. Then they have like an instrument, or they have a tool where they rub the tube, so that just a little tiny bit of sand comes out at a time, just a little tiny bit, so that they can draw with the sand, with this colored sand. And I don't know if you can see, but they're making like little images right here of different Buddhas. I mean, it can get very, very detailed. And here on this side you can see all the, they have people here, they have flowers and trees. I mean, it's just amazing. It takes days to make them. And there is a ceremony before they start making it where they dedicate the mandala to one of, maybe part of the Dharma, or to a bodhisattva, or to, the teachings, something like that. And then they make the mandala. And then when they're done, they have a short ceremony, and then they just sweep it up. They just sweep it up. And they put it into a bag, and they take it to a body of water, a natural body of water, a river or a lake, and they just pour it out. And it's doing that is a symbol of impermanence, right? Impermanence, anitya, right? That this world is impermanent. Everything passes away. And so they spend all this time on this beautiful work of art, and they just sweep it up because it's a symbol for life, right? And also, so the monks won't be attached to the fruit of their labor. They don't want you to get attached to this piece of art. It's supposed to inspire you. It's supposed to teach you, right? And the process of making it is an act of meditation, right? Of clearing the mind. You're very focused on the project at hand, but then you're not attached to the result of this action. You're sweeping it up and you're sending it away. Because like in Zen Buddhism, right? The process itself, the thing that you're doing, the doing of it is more important than the result. And that is a common theme throughout all Buddhist sects. Just like in Hinduism, do not be attached to the results of your actions. Rather, do them because they are right.